Greetings, Namo Buddhaya. I am KTS Sarao, former professor and head of the Department of Buddhist Studies, Delhi University, and Pro-Chancellor, Subharti University. In this module number 33, I shall be talking about as to whether the decline of Buddhism in India took place because of the animosity of Brahmins, hostile Brahmanical kings, and the rise of Bhakti movement. It is sometimes alleged that the Brahmins and some of their kings had an anti-Buddhist agenda. Some scholars have even accused the Brahmins of having specially created militias aimed at intimidating the Buddhists and appropriating their monasteries. Portrayal of the Buddha as a grand seducer in the Puranas, description of Buddhist deities as asuras, anti-Buddhist crusades of Kumaril Bhatt and Shankaracharya, and an attempt by Brahmins not only to burn the pavilion where Xuanzang was to be honored by King Harshvardhan, but also to kill Paro-Buddhist Harshvardhan himself, are given as important instances in support of such a hypothesis. Undoubtedly, there were occasions when Buddhist monks and nuns were ridiculed and harassed by Brahmins. Some aspects of the philosophy of Buddhism, especially its atheism and monks' dress and their shaven heads, may have often been the subjects of insensitive ridicule. It is not possible to find reliable evidence of any spirit of fanatical fury or fierce hatred in the sources. To the Brahmanical followers, Buddhism was a mere sect within the Brahmanical system, and the murders of Aryadev and Moglan were individual acts of crime. R.C. Mitra, for example, says, to quote him, "The attitude of the Hindus might have graduated from cold to scorching contempt, but a policy of hiring the Buddhists out with fire and sword sounds like a myth." Unquote. It was quite typical in India for holy persons to be surrounded by men and women of diverse religious backgrounds. Moreover, it may be pointed out that if some Brahmins were detractors of Buddhism, some of the best supporters of Buddhism were also Brahmins. Though the conflict of interests cannot be denied, there are not sufficient examples of overt hostility shown by the Brahmins to label them as communal. In fact, over a quarter of Buddhist monks and nuns mentioned in the Vinaya and Sutta Pitaka come from the Brahmanical caste. Thus, stray examples quoted in support of Brahmanical enmity and the resultant persecution are not enough to show that they caused the violent decline of Buddhism in India. However, membership of the Sangha by people of Brahman caste in large numbers appears to have steadily subverted institutional Buddhism from within in matters which either went against the interest of Brahmins as a caste or made Buddhism strikingly different from Puranic Brahmanism. After Buddhism became a pan-Indian religion from Ashoka's period onwards and assumed sufficient socio-political importance, the Brahmanical Brahmins, for their own survival, began a systematic subversion of institutional Buddhism so that the Buddha could be assimilated into the Brahmanical Hindu pantheon and lose his cultic veneration. Examples of wrangles between the followers of Buddha and those of different sects of Brahmanical Hinduism must be seen more as internal petty altercations within a broad Indian religious system rather than frenzied communal riots. Moreover, the Brahmanical malevolence, having an intellectual flavor above everything else, appears to have been directed primarily at the monastic movement and to some extent at the comparative opulence of the monasteries. Early Buddhist sources do not refer to any persecution. In fact, the Buddha made respectful reference to Brahmins who observed their vows in contradistinction to those who were mere Brahmins by birth. P.V. Kane, for example, says, to quote him, the dozens of suttas, meetings of Brahmins and the Buddha or his disciples and missionaries almost always seem to be marked by courtesy on both sides of meetings, are recorded in the early Pali texts or Brahmanical texts about Shakyans condemning the tenets of ancient Brahmanism, or about Brahmins censoring the Buddhist heterodoxy, unquote. The statement in the Kerala Utpatti that the Buddhists were driven out of Kerala by Kumaril Bhatt does not appear to be correct. His writings do not reflect any anti-Buddhist frenzy. In the exposition of his own philosophy, Kumaril admits the validity of the Vijnanavad doctrine. His respect for the Buddha only stops short of recognition of the avatarhood of the Buddha. With regard to allegations of anti-Buddhist actions of Shankaracharya, it may be said that he borrowed many of the ideas that had been formulated by Buddhist philosophers of the past. For instance, in his exposition that the world is an illusion, Shankaracharya borrowed arguments from Madhyamak and Yogachar. According to R.K. Das Gupta, Shankaracharya was the spiritual grandson of Gaudapad, whose ideas were a synthesis of Vedantism and Buddhism. There is no doubt that he made efforts to fortify his kind of Brahmanical Hinduism by enrolling missionaries in its defense and organizing them into corporate monastic schools under the central direction of the chief incumbent of Sringeri. But the legend of his having led a bloody crusade against the Buddhists cannot be sustained. Called a hidden Buddhist, Prachannabodh by some, Shankaracharya may not have been exactly a bosom pal of Buddhism. Still, no special animosity is betrayed against the Buddhists in the writings attributed to him. Though religious persecution of a limited and temporary character was not unknown, particularly in the South, Indian history does not bear out the fact of a continued and organized persecution as the state policy of a dynasty to the extent of exterminating an established faith. On the other hand, one can cite numerous instances of tolerance of Buddhism by Brahmanical rulers or of reverence to Brahmanical Hindu deities by Buddhists. A glimpse into the Gupta period may be illuminating, as it is generally held as the golden age of Brahmanical revival. Amar Kardab was a Buddhist general of many victories in the service of Chandragupta II, and the general in his grant to an Arya Sangh at Kakandabhot of Sanchi pronounces the guilt of the slaughter of a cow or a Brahman on anyone who would disturb it. This shows that the psyche of a Buddhist in the matter of taboos and inhibitions differed very little from that of a Brahmanical Hindu and had the same notions of heinous sins. Had the Buddha been hated by the Brahmanical society, the same society would not have accepted him as an incarnation of Vishnu. The Garud Puran invokes the Buddha as an incarnation of Vishnu for the protection of the world from sinners and not for deluding asuras to their ruin as in the Vishnu, Agni or other early Puranas. The Varaha Puran refers to the Buddha as the god of beauty. Superior contempt is the distinctively Hindu method of persecution. Puranas such as the Vishnu, Vayu and Matsya mention the Buddha as the grand seducer. The Yajnavalkya considers the sign of a monk with yellow robes as inauspicious. But this kind of attitude was not always one-sided, and some scholars have gone so far as to say that Buddhism was even more unfriendly towards Brahmanical Hinduism. For instance, there are images in which Indra always serves to bear the parasol and Ganesh is at the feet of Vignatak. However, such examples should not be stressed too far.